I know this isn't going to be a surprise to anyone, but when I was a child, I knew that I was supposed to be a priest. I had no idea how that was supposed to happen because just post-Vatican II Catholicism did not yet have a place for women as priests. And we noticed that the mainstream church still doesn't. But as a child and a young adult, I always held on to that idea about myself and just trusted that it would, I guess, miraculously happen one day. Things would change because I needed to live out my calling. Let me say it was a long, winding, and difficult road. Almost 40 years in my own personal vocational desert. But then I met the Roman Catholic women priests, and my personal vision started to actualize. Well, I believe the Transfiguration episode that we heard in today's gospel is the penultimate moment of Jesus' vocation story. Not the ultimate, obviously, that would be the resurrection. Yet for much of his life, Jesus held the idea that he was the Son of God. Remember when his parents had to find him in the temple when he was about 12 years old, and he chided them for their worry because he had to be about his Father's business? I don't believe he knew exactly what that would mean in his earliest years, but it was the theme that became quite explicit over the span of his shorterish life. But knowing that he was God's son did not give him the immediate knowledge of how that would play out. He may have wondered, am I going to ascend to a throne at a certain age and the earth period would end? Or would I rule from earth until the end of time? I just think for a long time, Jesus was unclear on the end part of his journey. However, at this point in today's gospel, it's obvious that a lot has been revealed to him, especially his gruesome death. His days of wilderness wooing in the desert are coming to a rapid end. Last week's gospel asked, for what will it profit them to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their life? That's a question that Jesus could have been asking himself too. Our own vocation stories bear a lot of similarities to some moments of Jesus' self-realization. We too know that we're children of God. We know that we'll spend a certain amount of time here in human form. We know it's not always going to be easy. And for some of us, life will be extremely difficult and perhaps tragic. But as Jesus learned to trust the intuitive voice of God, we must learn to trust the ever-present support of Jesus. For example, did you notice that as the disciples collapse to the ground in terror when they see the transfigured Jesus, he returns to his human form and touches them to quell their fear? The disciples were much more comfortable with a human Jesus. The transfigured Jesus took him away from the disciples' understanding of him as familiar, approachable, somewhat understandable, to an otherworldly entity. That was very scary for them. Jesus' own self-knowledge was of a very, very risky variety. He was here to change everything. He couldn't have known what he was to do in his earliest days. Instead, he had to live it. Our vocations, too, will be grasped similarly in faith, sustained in prayer, tested in confrontation, agonized over further in prayer and doubt, finally implemented in action with the belief that you had to do and be that person. That's how Jesus started too. He was born as the first among human equals and eventually, empowered by God, understood his divine agency as the Son. But that may not have happened if he had closed his mind and heart to the promptings of his spiritual self-knowledge. Jesus had the transfiguration moment to cement his disciples' courage to help them deal with what was to come, a crucified, defeated, and dead Messiah. How many of us have experienced something like a transfigured Jesus? A vision so profound and glorious that it will faithfully haul us through the messiness of life without any doubts. Not many, I suspect. Most of us are squinting into our daily routines looking for a sign, but that's okay. Because as wonderful as it may be to encounter a beauteous, divine Jesus to stir up our routine faith, I think it's more comforting and inspiring to find him amongst the here and now. We know all of life is sacred, but rarely is all of life spectacular. Yet in our daily lives, we're often granted the grace of feeling the presence of Christ. It's usually quiet, and it is there that if we're with Jesus, then we're always with Jesus, whether in much consolation or in indescribable pain. Jesus helps us to endure and progress regardless of circumstances. He'll carry our crosses with us right in this ordinary moment of time, so that we can grow stronger in our assurance of moving and living and having our being in Christ now and in the afterlife. Jesus is with us as we ultimately discover who we are to be for him. And that happens from our earliest days right up until our last day. We are being shaped and formed. This glorious vision of God's Son, one that the disciples initially misunderstood as Jesus coming to reify the law of Moses, was actually to lend courage to the hearts of his meek in order to build his kingdom.